At 00:57 hours, on July 24, 1943, a short Stirling bomber lifted off from RAF Meppal in Cambridgeshire. Its 4 Bristol Hercules engines roared into the darkness as the aircraft climbed steadily into the night sky over England. The summer air was warm at ground level, but the crew knew that at 18,000 feet, temperatures would drop well below freezing. Within the hour, 791 heavy bombers would form a stream, stretching 203 miles long, advancing at 160 miles per hour toward the German city of Hamburg. But this night would be different from every raid that had come before. Crouching in the freezing darkness near the aircraft's flare chute, a flight engineer held bundles of what looked like ordinary brown paper packets. Each bundle weighed about 1 pound. Inside were approximately 2,000 strips of coarse black paper backed with aluminum foil, each strip measuring just over 10 inches long and less than an inch wide. At the designated moment, he would begin dropping 1 bundle per minute, timed by stopwatch, scattering millions of these simple metallic strips into the night air over Germany. What happened next would change the course of the air war over Europe. On the ground below, German radar operators watched in horror as their screens dissolved into chaos. Displays that had shown clear, trackable bomber formations moments earlier now displayed an indistinguishable mass of white returns. Thousands of targets appeared where there had been hundreds. The entire radar network that had protected the Reich for years, a system built at enormous cost and manned by thousands of trained specialists, went blind in a matter of minutes. General Josef Kammhuber, the man who had designed Germany's integrated air defense system, would later state simply that the whole defense was blinded in one stroke. The weapon that accomplished this was not a bomb. It was not a rocket or a cannon or any conventional instrument of destruction. It was strips of aluminum foil, cut to a precise length, tumbling through the night air. The British called it window. The Americans called it chaff. The Germans had their own name for it, Dupel, because they had discovered the exact same technology more than a year earlier. And that is where this story truly begins. By 1943, Germany had constructed the most sophisticated integrated radar defense network the world had ever seen. This system had been built methodically over 3 years under the direction of General Josef Kammhuber, and the Allies called it the Kammhuber Line in recognition of its creator. Understanding this system is essential to grasping why Window was so devastating when it finally arrived. The system operated on 3 interlocking layers of radar technology. The first layer consisted of Freya early warning radars, named after the Norse goddess, who could see in the dark. These stations operated at frequencies between 120 and 166 MHz, with detection ranges up to 160 kilometers. Freya radars were large installations that required significant infrastructure and trained operators, but they provided Germany with vital advance warning of incoming bomber formations. The Freya network had proven its worth as early as December 18, 1939, when 2 stations detected 22 RAF Wellington bombers approaching Wilhelmshaven at a range of 113 kilometers. German fighters scrambled to intercept, and the resulting engagement was so devastating that it effectively forced Bomber Command to abandon daylight operations entirely. 12 Wellingtons were shot down that day, and Bomber Command learned a harsh lesson about the effectiveness of radar-guided defenses. By 1943, over 1,000 Freya stations guarded Germany's approaches from Norway to France. Once Freya detected incoming bomber formations, targets were handed off to the second layer, the precision tracking radars. These were the Wurzburg systems, operating at frequencies between 553 and 566 MHz. The standard Wurzburg used a 3-meter dish and could track a single heavy bomber at 29 kilometers, with range accuracy of just 25 meters. This precision was remarkable for the era and allowed German anti-aircraft gunners to direct their fire with deadly effectiveness. The critical variant was the giant Wurzburg, featuring a massive 7.4-meter dish. The antenna assembly alone weighed 15 tons. This enormous parabolic antenna could track targets at 70 kilometers with angular accuracy of 0.1 to 0.2 degrees. Germany produced over 4,000 standard Wurzburg units and up to 1,500 giant Wurzburg systems. These precision radars fed target data directly to the Kommandogerät 40 analog fire control computer, which calculated firing solutions for the lethal 88mm flak batteries that ringed every major German city. The third layer was airborne. German twin-engine night fighters, primarily Messerschmitt B F-110 and Junkers Ju-88 aircraft, were equipped with Liechtenstein B-C radar. Operating at 490 MHz, the Liechtenstein system featured a distinctive 32-dipole antenna array that German crews nicknamed the Matratze, meaning mattress. This bristling array of antenna elements protruding from the nose of night fighters imposed a significant aerodynamic penalty, reducing speed and maneuverability. But the tactical advantage it provided was worth the cost. Liechtenstein allowed night fighters to detect bombers at ranges up to 4 kilometers and close for the kill in total darkness. Before radar-equipped night fighters, intercepting bombers at night was largely a matter of luck, depending on searchlights, moonlight, or chance visual contact. Liechtenstein changed that equation completely. The first Liechtenstein-assisted victory came on August 8–9, 1941, when pilot Ludwig Becker shot down a Wellington bomber. From that night forward, German night fighters became increasingly deadly. These three layers were integrated through what the Germans called the Himmelbett system. This name translated to four-poster bed in English, referring to the cozy, confined space in which each engagement would take place. Each Himmelbett zone covered an area approximately 32 kilometers long by 20 kilometers wide. Within each zone sat one Freya radar for early warning, two giant Wurzburg radars for precision tracking, and one or two assigned night fighters on standby. The system worked like this. When Freya detected an incoming bomber, one Wurzburg would begin tracking the hostile aircraft, while the second Wurzburg tracked the defending night fighter as it took off or moved to intercept. A ground controller watched both tracks plotted on a glass Seeberg table, where the bomber appeared as a red spotlight and the fighter as blue. The controller radioed vectoring instructions to the fighter pilot, guiding him through the darkness until visual or radar contact was achieved. The fighter would then close for the kill. These Himmelbett zones stretched 3 layers deep from Denmark through the Netherlands, Belgium, and into central France. Several hundred of these boxes formed an enormous defensive arc protecting the German homeland. The system was methodical, precise, and deadly. RAF crews called flying through this defensive wall running the gauntlet. The German flak arm that these radars served was enormous. By 1944, 2,655 heavy anti-aircraft batteries and 1,612 light batteries defended Germany. Over 1 million Luftwaffe personnel were assigned to flak duties alone, representing a massive commitment of manpower that might otherwise have served on the fighting fronts. Radar-directed 88mm guns accounted for 41% of all Bomber Command losses over the entire war. The famous 88 was both an anti-aircraft weapon and an anti-tank gun, and every one pointed skyward over Germany was unavailable to stop Allied tanks on the ground. Albert Speer later called this massive defensive commitment a second front. By September 1943, 8,876 dual-purpose 88mm guns and 25,000 light flak guns protected the homeland. These were weapons that would otherwise have been sent to fight the Soviets on the Eastern Front or to reinforce German positions in Italy and France. For RAF bomber crews, flying into this defensive wall was a nightmare. Loss rates on major German targets averaged 4 to 6%, with heavily defended cities like Hamburg consistently at the higher end. Those percentages sound small, but their cumulative effect was devastating. A 6% loss rate meant that a bomber crew flying a standard tour of 30 missions had only about a 16% chance of completing their tour without being killed or captured. The mathematics of attrition were merciless. A squadron that started a month with 20 crews might have only 12 remaining by month's end. New crews arrived to fill empty bunks, learned the ropes quickly or died trying, and were themselves replaced in turn. The average age of bomber aircrew was 22. Many had volunteered straight from school or university. They came from across the British Empire, from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and from occupied nations like Poland and Czechoslovakia whose citizens had fled to continue the fight. Young men wrote letters to their families before each mission, uncertain whether they would return. Some wrote letters to be opened only if they did not come back, expressing thoughts too difficult to speak aloud. Ground crews watched the skies anxiously each morning, counting the returning aircraft and noting the empty hardstands where bombers would never return. When aircraft failed to return, their belongings were quietly packed up and their bunks stripped for the next occupants. There was no time for extended grief in Bomber Command. The tension before each mission was almost unbearable. Briefings revealed the night's target, and groans would rise when the map showed a heavily defended city deep in Germany. Veterans later recalled the sick feeling in their stomachs before major raids. Every experienced crew member knew that sensation, the cold certainty that the coming night might be their last. Some men vomited before climbing into their aircraft. Others grew eerily calm. The journey to the target was an exercise in controlled terror. Crews flew through the darkness, watching flak bursts light the sky around them, seeing other bombers caught in searchlights and ripped apart by cannon fire or exploding in fireballs as flak found fuel tanks. Night fighters were an invisible threat, striking without warning from below or behind. A bomber might fly peacefully through the night and then suddenly shudder as cannon shells tore through its fuselage. Many crews died without ever knowing what had hit them. Those who survived the mission faced the return journey, often in damaged aircraft with wounded crewmates, hoping to make it back across the North Sea to England before fuel ran out or engines failed. Landing a damaged bomber at night required skill and luck in equal measure. Many aircraft that had survived the flak and fighters crashed on landing, killing crews who had thought themselves safe. The radar-guided defenses were simply too effective, too precise, too deadly. The Kammhuber Line and its associated systems were exacting an unsustainable toll on Bomber Command. Something had to change, or the strategic bombing offensive would bleed itself to death over Germany. Unknown to the German defenders, a simple and devastating countermeasure had been sitting in British laboratories for more than a year. British intelligence had been studying German radar systems intensively since the war began. The first breakthrough came in November 1939, when an anonymous package arrived at the British Embassy in Oslo, Norway. Inside was a detailed report on German military technology, including information about radar development. The sender was later identified as Hans Ferdinand Mayer, a German scientist who opposed the Nazi regime. This Oslo report, as it became known, alerted R.V. Jones and other British scientists to the existence and scope of German radar technology. Further intelligence came from an audacious commando raid. On the night of February 27 to 28, 1942, 120 British paratroopers under Major John Frost dropped near the French coastal village of Bruneval. Their target was a Wurzburg radar installation perched on a clifftop overlooking the English Channel. RAF technician, Flight Sergeant C.W.H. Cox, accompanied the raiders with instructions to dismantle key components of the radar under fire. The raid was a success. Cox and the paratroopers seized critical components of the Wurzburg and escaped by boat under German fire. Analysis of the captured equipment revealed exactly how the Wurzburg worked and, crucially, confirmed that all German radars operated in no more than 3 frequency ranges. This meant they could be systematically jammed once the right countermeasures were developed. The concept that metal strips could overwhelm radar with false echoes had emerged almost simultaneously on both sides of the conflict. As early as 1937, British researcher Gerald Touch suggested that wire lengths suspended from balloons might swamp radar returns. R.V. Jones, who would become Britain's chief scientific intelligence officer, independently proposed that metal foil falling through the air could generate radar echoes indistinguishable from actual aircraft. The physics was straightforward, but turning theory into a practical weapon required experimentation. It was Joan Curran who made the crucial breakthrough. She was a Cambridge-educated Welsh physicist and the only woman scientist at the Telecommunications research establishment, known by its initials TRE. The TRE was Britain's secret radar research facility, relocated from its original home on the vulnerable southern coast to Malvern College in Worcestershire. There, teams of brilliant scientists worked on radar systems and countermeasures that would prove decisive in the war. In early 1942, working in the TRE countermeasures group, Curran conducted the first practical window experiment. The preparation was remarkably simple. Her husband Samuel Curran later recalled the moment. At home, she cut up a large amount of metal foil with her household scissors, and then she organized the dropping of the thin metal foil strips from an aircraft sent up from Christchurch Aerodrome. She had arranged that observation at the radar detection stations on the ground should be done. The effects on the radar screens were truly amazing, and it looked as if a large fleet of aircraft was present. Curran herself described the experiment with characteristic understatement. "I cut up copper foil and made strings or ladders of the bits, and the first trial was carried out one Saturday morning at Sturminster Marshall GCI station. The results of this primitive experiment were quite spectacular, the whole baseline of the display unit being deflected. The radar operators could not distinguish between the falling foil strips and actual aircraft. A few strips of metal could create radar returns equivalent to a heavy bomber. The codename Window was coined when TRE Superintendent A.P. Rowe simply looked around the room during a naming discussion and settled on what he saw. The physics behind Window was elegant in its simplicity. Each strip was cut to approximately half the wavelength of the target radar frequency. At that precise length, the metal resonates when struck by radar waves, re-radiating the signal as a dipole antenna would. A cloud of just a few hundred strips could reflect as much radar energy as a heavy bomber. British scientists described it as the radar equivalent of a smokescreen. Window worked because radar cannot distinguish between different objects that produce similar returns. A strip of metal cut to the right length reflects radar waves just as effectively as the metal skin of an aircraft. By flooding the sky with thousands of such strips, defenders saw thousands of targets on their screens, with no way to identify which were real bombers and which were falling foil. What followed the successful experiment was 15 months of agonizing paralysis. Professor Frederick Lindemann, also known as Lord Cherwell, served as Winston Churchill's chief scientific advisor. Lindemann was a brilliant but controversial figure whose influence over Churchill was immense. He warned urgently that the Luftwaffe would immediately copy Window if the British used it first. He predicted that German bombers, equipped with the technology, would launch a devastating new blitz against British cities, and that British radar defences would be helpless to stop them. Fighter Command Chief Air Marshal Sholto Douglas agreed with this assessment. So did the Ministry of Home Security. Britain had survived the Blitz of 1940 to 1941, largely because radar allowed fighters to intercept German bombers before they reached their targets. If Window blinded British radar, German night bombers could strike with impunity. The prospect was terrifying. Against this cautious faction stood R.V. Jones, the brilliant young physicist Henry Tizard, and Bomber Command Chief Air Marshal Arthur Harris, known widely as Bomber Harris. They argued relentlessly that the benefits of Window far outweighed the risks. Harris made his position clear in characteristically blunt terms. In his view, the biggest mistake any military leader could make was to assume that withholding a weapon would prevent the enemy from developing the same technology independently. Harris suspected, correctly as it turned out, that the Germans had likely discovered the same vulnerability themselves. The physics were not complicated. Any competent radar engineer could work out that metal strips at the right wavelength would create false echoes. The only question was who would use the countermeasure first and accept the consequences. The cost of delay was staggering. While the debate raged through meetings and memoranda, Bomber Command continued to suffer terrible losses over Germany. Thousands of aircrew were killed or captured, and hundreds of aircraft were destroyed during the 15 months that Window sat unused. These were losses that the countermeasure might have significantly reduced. Young men died in burning aircraft over Germany while strips of aluminum foil sat in British laboratories, waiting for permission to be used. Several factors finally converged by mid-1943 to tip the balance toward deployment. The Luftwaffe bomber threat to Britain had diminished sharply as German resources were consumed by the Eastern Front. The massive German military effort in Russia left few bombers available for raids on Britain. The feared new blitz seemed increasingly unlikely. Additionally, Britain had developed new centimetric radars operating at much shorter wavelengths than the Wurzburg targeted by Window. These radars could cope with any German retaliation using the same technology. Britain's defences would not be helpless, even if Germany used chaff. Most importantly, in May 1943, a Junkers Ju-88R one-night fighter defected to Scotland. The German crew landed their aircraft intact at RAF Dice, and British technicians found a complete Liechtenstein radar system aboard. This was an intelligence windfall of enormous value. Analysis confirmed that German airborne radar systems were vulnerable to the same jamming that affected ground-based Wurzburg units. Window would blind both the ground controllers and the night fighters themselves. On July 15, 1943, a meeting attended by Churchill himself agreed that the benefits now outweighed the risks. Window would be deployed. Churchill formally authorized its use on July 23. Harris finally had his weapon. He chose Operation Gomorrah, the planned destruction of Hamburg, as Window's combat debut. Hamburg was Germany's second-largest city, a vital port handling enormous quantities of war material. Its shipyards produced U-boats that were strangling Britain's Atlantic supply lines. Its factories manufactured aircraft and refined petroleum. It was also one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe, ringed by flak batteries and covered by the Kammhuber Line. The first raid launched on the night of July 24, 1943. 791 bombers formed the massive attacking force, including 347 Lancasters, 246 Halifaxes, 125 Stirlings, and 73 Wellingtons. It was the largest bomber force yet assembled for a single target. The window strips had been manufactured to precise specifications based on Joan Curran's experiments. Each strip measured approximately 27 centimeters long by 2 centimeters wide, roughly half the wavelength of the Wurzburg radar. Bundles of approximately 2,000 strips were packed into brown paper packets, with each bundle weighing about 1 pound. Every bomber in the stream carried these bundles. The briefing instructions were specific. Designated crew members would begin dispensing bundles at the rate of 1 bundle per minute, timed by stopwatch. Dropping would begin approximately 60 miles from the target as the force entered Wurzburg range. On that first night over Hamburg, roughly 7,000 bundles were dispensed. That meant over 15 million individual strips fluttering into the darkness, slowly drifting downward like metallic snow. The effect on German defences was instantaneous and catastrophic. On Wurzburg screens across the defensive network, operators saw their displays dissolve into an indistinguishable mass of white returns. Each bundle of approximately 2,000 strips appeared as a bomber-sized target. With thousands of bundles descending simultaneously, the screens showed what looked like an armada of thousands upon thousands of aircraft. It was impossible to distinguish real bombers from chaff clouds. The paired giant Wurzburg radars that formed the backbone of the Himmelbett system could no longer function. Night fighters equipped with Liechtenstein BC radar experienced the same blinding effect. Their cockpit displays were swamped with false echoes at every range and bearing. Pilots who had trained for months to interpret the subtle returns of their radar sets now stared at screens filled with meaningless static. RAF crews flying in the bomber stream that night observed the chaos unfolding below. The master searchlights and all the others were waving aimlessly across the sky. The lights that usually converged on bombers with terrifying precision were wandering randomly, unable to find targets. Crews who had braced for the worst found themselves passing through the defences almost unopposed. German night fighter pilot Rolf Angersbach was flying a Dornier D-0217 that night. He obeyed orders to head for Hamburg, but found himself surrounded by slow-moving radar contacts with no actual aircraft visible anywhere. He flew through the darkness, his radar showing targets everywhere and targets nowhere. After firing his guns across the sky in frustration, attempting to hit something, anything, he was ordered to land. He later recalled finding everyone at the airfield helpless and bewildered. No one knew what had happened or how to respond. Hamburg's flak batteries maintained discipline despite losing all radar guidance. German military training and discipline were excellent, and the gun crews continued firing. They fired 50,000 rounds that night, an enormous expenditure of ammunition. But without radar guidance, accuracy was negligible. The shells burst harmlessly across the sky, nowhere near the bombers they were meant to destroy. The radar-guided master searchlights wandered without purpose, their beams sweeping randomly. Only one confirmed night fighter kill occurred directly over Hamburg itself. The results were dramatic and immediate. Of 791 bombers dispatched, only 12 were lost. This represented a loss rate of just 1.5%, compared to typical rates of approximately 6% for heavily defended targets like Hamburg. Window had achieved a 75% reduction in bomber losses in a single night. Pathfinder aircraft marked accurately using H-2S radar, and the main force dropped 2,300 tons of bombs between 1:02 and 1:50 in the morning. The raid was a devastating success, both in terms of damage inflicted and in the survival of the attacking force. Operation Gomorrah continued with multiple raids over the following days. American B-17 bombers of the 8th Air Force attacked by day on July 25 and 26. Then came the second major RAF night attack on July 27 to 28. This raid would produce the most catastrophic result of the entire operation. Of the bombers dispatched that night, 739 reached Hamburg and dropped 2,326 tons of bombs, mostly incendiaries. The bombs were concentrated into a 2-mile by 1-mile area in just 50 minutes. Conditions that night in Hamburg were unusually favorable for what followed. It was summer, the air was hot and dry, and the previous raids had already started numerous fires that the fire services were struggling to contain. The concentrated incendiary attack was about to create something that had never been seen before in modern warfare. What followed was the first urban firestorm in history. The concentrated incendiary attacks ignited fires across a wide area simultaneously. As the fires grew, they began to consume oxygen at an enormous rate. Cool air rushed in from surrounding areas to feed the flames, creating hurricane-force winds of up to 150 miles per hour. These winds fed the flames further, creating a feedback loop of increasing intensity. According to the Hamburg police president's report, temperatures in the firestorm zone approached 1,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt glass and aluminum. A fire tornado 1,500 feet tall raged for 3 hours over the city centre. The roaring of the flames could be heard for miles. The sound was so loud that some survivors compared it to the sound of an express train passing through their street continuously. People caught in the streets were swept off their feet by the winds and carried into the inferno. Others found their clothing catching fire from the radiant heat, even when no flame touched them. Asphalt in the streets began to melt and bubble, trapping the feet of those trying to flee. Those who sought shelter in basements and cellars faced a different death. As the firestorm raged above, it consumed all available oxygen and generated deadly carbon monoxide. Ventilation shafts that normally brought fresh air into shelters instead drew the poisonous gases downward. Whole families died together in their shelters, many found in positions suggesting they had simply gone to sleep. The lucky ones lost consciousness quickly. Others fought for breath as the air turned toxic around them. The heat was so intense that trees exploded as the sap inside them vaporized. Fire crews attempting to fight the blaze found that their hoses were useless against temperatures that turned water to steam before it could reach the flames. Many firefighters died at their posts, overcome by heat and smoke. The few who survived described scenes beyond their ability to comprehend. Streets transformed into rivers of fire, buildings collapsing into white-hot rubble. The Hamburg police president's report described the scene as a fire typhoon, such as was never before witnessed, against which every human resistance was quite useless. Approximately 34,000 people died that single night, most from carbon monoxide poisoning as the fire consumed oxygen from basement air raid shelters. The firestorm's intense updraft drew air out of shelters through ventilation shafts. Many victims were found with no visible injuries, having simply suffocated as the inferno stole their breath. Families sheltering together died together, some still clutching photographs or treasured possessions they had tried to save. Bodies were found in cellars weeks later as rescue crews worked through the rubble. Across all Operation Gomorrah raids, RAF loss rates progressively increased as German defenders began adapting. From 1.5% on the first night, losses rose to 2.2%, then 3.6%, and finally 4.1% on the last major raid. But the rates never returned to the devastating pre-window levels. Total RAF losses for the entire operation were 87 aircraft and their crews. Total casualties in Hamburg reached roughly 37,000 dead. Over 1 million civilians were evacuated from a city where 60% of housing was destroyed. Hamburg's industrial output was devastated, though remarkably, the city would eventually recover to 80% of normal production within 5 months. Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments, later testified that if the Allies had repeated this success against 4 or 5 other German cities, Germany would have collapsed. The war might have ended in 1943 rather than 1945. The deepest and most bitter irony of Window was that German scientists understood exactly what had happened immediately. They understood it because they had invented the same technology themselves more than a year earlier. German engineers had codenamed their version Dupel after the Berlin suburb where testing had occurred in 1942. Trials proved that 5 strips of foil-produced radar returns equivalent to a Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter. The technology worked perfectly, and German scientists understood its devastating potential. But Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had personally ordered all Doppelwerk suppressed. He prohibited anyone from speaking of it, for precisely the same reasons that Lindemann had argued against Window in Britain. Göring feared the British would copy the technology and use it to blind German radar defences during a renewed bombing campaign against the Reich. This fear was reasonable, but the suppression went too far. The critical difference was that Göring's suppression also prevented development of countermeasures. Germany had no ready defence when Window arrived, because German scientists had been forbidden from working on solutions. They could not discuss how to defeat chaff, because they could not even acknowledge that chaff existed. Göring's reaction after Hamburg was characteristically dramatic. According to accounts from German military staff, he expressed grudging admiration for British radar technology while berating his own scientists for failing to anticipate the countermeasure. His frustration was all the more bitter because his own orders had prevented any defensive preparations. Field Marshal Erhard Milch recognized the grave implications. The German air defense system that had taken years to build was suddenly vulnerable, and the British were exploiting that vulnerability with devastating effect. Germany responded to the Window crisis with remarkable speed at the tactical level. Major Hajo Hermann had actually proposed his Wilde Sau tactics on June 27, 1943, weeks before Window's debut. The name translated to wild boar in English. Hermann had recognized that visual interception could supplement radar when conditions permitted, and the Hamburg disaster proved him right. The Wild Sau concept was simple but dangerous for the German pilots executing it. Single-engine day fighters, primarily Fokker-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt B F-109 aircraft, would operate above a prearranged flak ceiling and attack bombers visually. They would silhouette their targets against burning cities, searchlights, and illuminated cloud layers. Without radar guidance, the pilots relied on their eyes and their skill. Hermann had first tested the tactic over Cologne on July 3–4, 1943, where his pilots shot down 12 bombers using only visual identification. After Hamburg proved the necessity of alternatives to radar-guided interception, Göring summoned Hermann to his estate and authorized the formation of Jagdgeschwader 300, which translates to Fighter Wing 300. Additional units designated 301 and 302 followed. The complementary Zahme tactic was developed by Oberst Viktor von Lossberg. This name translated to tame boar. The approach freed twin-engine night fighters from their rigid Himmelbett boxes. Instead of waiting in assigned zones for individual targets to enter their area, fighters infiltrated the bomber stream directly. They were guided by running commentary, which meant ground controllers broadcasting the stream's position and heading to all available fighters simultaneously. Critically, Window itself was turned against the British. German controllers learned to track chaff concentrations to identify the bomber stream's location and direction of flight. Where the chaff clouds were thickest, that was where the bombers had to be. The British countermeasure became a beacon pointing directly at the attacking force. On the technology front, German engineers deployed the Wurzlaus modification within just 2 weeks of Window's debut. The name combined Wurzburg with Laus, meaning louse. This was a Doppler filter that could distinguish moving aircraft from slowly drifting chaff by detecting frequency shifts of 200 to 700 Hz caused by the bomber's movement. Aircraft maintaining formation speed produced a different radar signature than foil strips floating on the wind. The Liechtenstein SN2 radar began entering service in late 1943. Operating at 90 MHz, corresponding to a 3.33 meter wavelength, this radar worked at frequencies far below those targeted by Window's precisely cut strips. The SN2 could see through the chaff clouds that blinded the earlier Liechtenstein BC systems. Passive detection systems complemented these active radar countermeasures. The Naxos Z device, homed on British H-2S radar emissions at ranges up to 35 kilometers, British bombers used H-2S to navigate and identify targets, but the radar emissions gave away their positions. The Flensburg system detected the Monaco tail warning radar that British bombers carried for defensive purposes. Flensburg could detect Monaco at considerable distances, allowing night fighters to home in on bombers from beyond visual range. The British responded with their own escalating electronic warfare campaign. In November 1943, Bomber Command established No. 100 Special Duties Group, the first dedicated electronic warfare organization in military history. This unit deployed an extraordinary arsenal of jamming and deception systems that evolved throughout the remainder of the war. The group's aircraft flew alongside the main bomber stream, creating an invisible electronic shield around the attacking force. Mandrel jammers targeted Freya early warning radars, creating a wall of static that masked the approaching bombers. Carpet-jammed Wurzburg gun-laying radars. Airborne Cigar, known as ABC, was carried aboard specially equipped Lancasters of 101 Squadron. These aircraft carried German-speaking operators who jammed fighter controller frequencies with false commands and interference. Corona broadcast fake instructions to German night fighters from ground stations located in England, sometimes ordering fighters to land while the bomber stream was still overhead. The Serrate system allowed mosquito intruders to home on Liechtenstein radar emissions, turning the German night fighters' own radar into a liability that attracted British hunters. German pilots learned to their horror that their radar could bring destruction from above rather than revealing prey below. The cat-and-mouse cycle continued relentlessly throughout the air war. When the British discovered that the Germans had built Flensburg to home on Monaco emissions, they removed Monaco from their bombers entirely. Then they reinstalled it on selected aircraft as bait to lure night fighters relying on Flensburg into ambushes. Each countermeasure bred countermeasures in an endless spiral of technological innovation. American scientists contributed equally to the electronic warfare effort. Fred Whipple, at Harvard's Radio Research Laboratory, created cardboard packets he nicknamed dehydrated bombers. Each produced a radar return the size of a B-17 heavy bomber. Merwin Bly solved the critical problem of chaff strips, clumping together by designing an electrostatic dispensing system that separated them properly as they fell. The United States ultimately produced nearly 13 million pounds of chaff and over 8 million pounds of aluminum rope during the war. Chaff is credited with saving an estimated 8,000 Allied airmen, including 600 heavy bomber crews in Europe and 200 B-29 crews in the Pacific Theater. On June 6, 1944, Window played a crucial role in the D-Day deception operations. In Operation Taxable, Lancasters of 617 Squadron dropped precisely calculated chaff patterns over the English Channel, while 218 Squadron flew Operation Glimmer. These patterns created phantom radar signatures that appeared to German operators as invasion fleets heading for the Pas de Calais region. The aircraft flew precise racetrack patterns, each pass slightly closer to France, simulating the advance of massive naval convoys. German coastal radar stations tracked these phantom fleets and reported invasion forces approaching the wrong beaches. German attention was drawn away from the real landings in Normandy, contributing to the success of the greatest amphibious invasion in history. The statistical arc of the air war after Window tells a story of initial Allied triumph, determined German adaptation, and eventual Allied dominance through escalating electronic warfare. Before Window, Bomber Command loss rates on major German targets averaged 4 to 6%. Window's introduction slashed losses dramatically. The aggregate loss rate across Operation Gomorrah's 3 major night raids was just 2.4%. But by autumn 1943, the combined Wilde and Zahme tactics, augmented by SN2 radar and passive detection systems, were steadily recovering effectiveness. During the Battle of Berlin, which lasted from November 1943 through March 1944, loss rates climbed back to an average of 5.1% across 19 major raids. This campaign cost Air Marshal Harris more than 1,000 experienced bomber crews. The German recovery was demonstrated most brutally on the night of March 30 to 31, 1944. This was the Nuremberg raid, which became known as Bomber Command's Black Friday. General Joseph Schmid, who had replaced the dismissed Kammhuber as commander of German night fighter forces, correctly ignored all diversionary attacks that night. He assembled over 200 night fighters along the anticipated bomber route through Belgium and into Germany. In bright moonlight, Fighters tore into the bomber stream before it even crossed into German airspace. 95 bombers were lost that night, an 11.9% loss rate. 545 aircrew were killed and 157 were captured. Nuremberg itself was barely damaged because smoke and incorrect marking obscured the target. Individual German ace pilots scored multiple kills in a single sortie. It was the worst night in Bomber Command history, a grim reminder that the air war remained deadly despite all countermeasures. Yet the broader strategic picture overwhelmingly favoured the Allies. Window and the escalating British electronic warfare campaign forced Germany into an enormous defensive resource commitment. Over 1 million personnel were tied to air defence duties. Thousands of 88mm guns that could have been used as anti-tank weapons on the Eastern Front instead pointed skyward over German cities. The technology born from Joan Curran's Saturday morning experiment with household scissors and copper foil launched what became the modern discipline of electronic warfare. Her contribution to the Allied war effort was enormous. While her husband Samuel worked on the atomic bomb at Berkeley, Joan's invention was saving the lives of bomber crews over Germany, night after night. Chaff remains a standard military countermeasure in use worldwide today. Modern warships carry chaff launchers as standard defensive systems against anti-ship missiles. Combat aircraft deploy chaff cartridges to defeat radar-guided missiles. Ballistic missiles carry chaff as penetration aids against anti-ballistic missile defenses. The technology has evolved from aluminum-backed paper to metallized glass fibers, but the fundamental physics remain unchanged from those first strips Joan Curran cut in 1942. The window story contains lessons that extend far beyond military technology. Both Britain and Germany independently discovered the same radar vulnerability and the same method to exploit it. Both nations then suppressed the technology out of identical fears. Each government believed that using the countermeasure would give it to the enemy and invite retaliation. The difference in outcomes came from how each side handled the suppression. Britain eventually overcame its caution and deployed window, while simultaneously developing countermeasures against German retaliation. Germany's suppression was absolute. Göring's orders not only prohibited use of Dupel, but prevented any work on defending against it. When the inevitable moment arrived, Germany had no ready response. The Reich's defenders watched their screens go white and had nothing to fall back on. The 15-month British delay, driven by Lindemann's caution and the fear of German retaliation, cost thousands of aircrew killed or captured. These were preventable losses that haunt the historical record. Operation Gomorrah killed approximately 37,000 Hamburg civilians. War produces no clean outcomes. What began with strips of foil cut by household scissors has evolved into a domain where nations compete with the most sophisticated technology available. Satellites monitor electronic emissions from orbit. Computer-controlled systems jam and deceive enemy sensors in microseconds. Artificial intelligence analyzes electronic signals to identify threats and opportunities. Every modern Air Force, Navy, and Army maintains specialized electronic warfare units descended in concept from No. 100 Group. All of it traces back to that summer night over Hamburg in July 1943, when bundles of aluminum strips tumbling through the darkness made German shells miss their targets. The radar operators who watched their screens dissolve into static were witnessing the birth of a new dimension of warfare. The bomber crews who survived that night because of window carried home more than their own lives. They carried proof that ingenuity could defeat the most sophisticated defenses technology could create. Joan Curran, working with scissors and foil in a British laboratory, had changed the nature of warfare forever. Sometimes the simplest solutions prove the most devastating, and sometimes strips of metal falling through the night sky can blind an empire. The men who flew those missions would carry complex memories for the rest of their lives. They had survived when survival seemed impossible, but they had also played a role in creating the firestorm. The moral weight of strategic bombing haunted many veterans long after the guns fell silent. For the German defenders, the confusion left deep scars. Highly trained specialists watched their instruments fail, their carefully practiced procedures rendered worthless. The technological superiority they had relied upon evaporated in minutes. Window saved thousands of Allied airmen. It enabled the destruction that broke Germany's second-largest city. It launched a new form of warfare that continues to shape military technology today.